G'day and welcome back to CounterCulture, brought to you by The Spectator Australia and the Institute of Public Affairs. Well, to paraphrase Bill Murray, it's lockdown day in Victoria again. Cian Hussey joins us to talk about his research on who wins from all these lockdowns and the working people who lose. Dr. Tanveer Ahmed makes some important arguments against euthanasia. Rachel Wong joins us to talk about childcare and whether women really want to work longer hours. Rowan Dean reacts to rising anti-Semitism overseas, and Sarah Dudley reminds us that it was Spectator Australia authors who were among the first to look into whether the coronavirus came not from a bowl of bat soup, but from a CCP lab. All that and more coming up on CounterCulture. Let's do it! The question I keep asking myself is, when will this ever end? I'm talking, of course, about the never-ending coronavirus saga, the temporary disruption to our normal lives that somehow became permanent COVID normal, as they say. As you may remember, I and the IPA were the very first in Australia to oppose lockdowns, right back in April last year. And the reason we did that, apart from the abject wrongness of it all, was that we knew that a government that could put millions under house arrest with the stroke of a pen, well, it was a government capable of all manner of barbarity against its own citizens. And sadly, we have been proven correct time after time after time in ways that even in my wildest paranoid libertarian fantasies, I never would have imagined. You know, we've seen Centrelink queues stretching around the block. We've seen the police kick old ladies off park benches. We've seen pregnant women getting arrested over Facebook posts. We've seen babies die in utero because border closures delayed urgent medical treatment. We've seen public housing towers turned into giant prisons. We've seen a class of internally displaced people over a summer in which borders were slammed shut with extremely little notice. We've seen Australian citizens rendered stateless and threatened with jail time for entering their own country. And this week, we've seen another decree by press conference, another set of punitive restrictions, as just a handful of cases have sent the City of Melbourne once again, at time of recording, teetering on the edge of a 7-day lockdown. And all of that is before you get to the long-term consequences, the deep and lasting societal damage that will result from politicians burning down Australia in order to save it. In this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia, the IPA's Cian Hussey makes the observation that coronavirus hysteria has resulted in one of the greatest transfers of wealth that the world has ever seen, at the expense of working people in Australia and around the world. Let's hear from him now. Cian Hussey, how are you?
Very good, thank you, Gideon. Great to be on the show.
Mate, great to have you here at last, and great to see you making your debut in The Spectator Australia in the print edition. You've been in flat white many, many times, but this is your first piece in print. It's excellent. It's something that a lot of people don't think about when it comes to the coronavirus hysteria we've seen for the last 15 months or so. And basically your thesis is that in addition to destroying our freedoms, it's actually led to the greatest concentration of wealth, certainly that we've seen in our lifetimes at the very least. So talk us through what COVID has done to the distribution of wealth in Australia and elsewhere.
Well, we knew right from the start that COVID was going to have, the lockdowns in response to COVID were going to have very different impacts on different parts of society. And one thing that became evident very quickly was that small businesses were going to bear the brunt of the lockdown measures, and bigger businesses would fare a little bit better. Some of this is just to do with the way that all recessions go. Smaller businesses are less likely to have capital reserves, they're less likely to have savings and buffers, whereas larger businesses have deeper pockets and they can also draw on, they can raise capital more easily. So we at the IPA were the only organisation in Australia really talking about this back in April and May of last year. So we sounded the warning very early on. The lockdowns were going to cause a concentration of wealth. They come at the expense of lower income people, and they've actually, in many cases, enriched parts of the public sector. They've enriched bigger corporations, and that's what I tease out in my article. We've seen recently people start to talk about the wealth that's accrued to billionaires over the last year. And there's been articles in major newspapers, and people start to talk about how billionaires have increased their wealth by billions and billions of dollars over the past year. And my response really is, well, where were you people 12 months ago when we were sounding the alarm on this? You know, the political left has for forever been going on about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And then when we had the single largest concentration of wealth in recent history, the left completely left the field and they just allowed it to happen. They didn't criticize these lockdown measures at all. So that's really the purpose of the article.
You've used the example of Amazon, which really just says it all about the destruction of small businesses and the subsequent benefit to somebody like Jeff Bezos. So sort of draw that out for us. What does that look like, and why should we be concerned?
So one of the things with lockdown measures was this arbitrary distinction between essential and non-essential businesses. So when we had the lockdown over Valentine's Day in Victoria earlier this year, florists were deemed non-essential on their busiest trading weekend of the year. So small florists weren't allowed to open and sell flowers, but you could still go down to Woolies and buy some flowers. So that's the very basic example of how lockdown measures disproportionately affect smaller businesses. And then we've seen this with Amazon. So before the lockdowns, Amazon's market cap was about $940 billion US dollars. And today it's closer to $1.7 trillion. And while the main street businesses, the high street businesses, the brick and mortar small businesses were all suffering immensely between April and August of 2020, Amazon's share price was rocketing up. And I think that's a very clear indication of what went on. And Jeff Bezos' own personal wealth increased by some tens of billions of dollars, while hundreds of thousands of Australians were forced to go for months without wages, have their hours cut and lose their jobs. So that's really the divide that we're seeing.
One thing we at the IPA often talk about is the Canberra cartel, big business, big unions, big government. So that's the big government side of the equation, the big business side of the equation that we've just talked about. But going back to the big government, another thing we talk about here at the Institute of Public Affairs is the fact that the recovery from the self-induced economic crisis that we've put ourselves in is not an L-shaped or a V-shaped or whatever else. It is a K-shaped recovery with private sector workers doing badly and public sector workers doing better. And these are the people who are dreaming up ways to keep us under house arrest and wearing masks and what have you. So what does IPA research show about the widening divide between the public and the private sectors?
Well, again, this was something that we identified very early on. So in May of last year, we released a report and we found that due to lockdown measures, the private sector were losing jobs at 4.5 times the rate that the public sector were losing jobs. What we later found out is that no public sector workers actually ever lost their jobs. By November last year, there were still hundreds of thousands of private sector workers who had not yet returned to work. And we had some 26,000 new public sector workers. And like you said, these are the people who are dreaming up the lockdown measures. These are the people who decide when lockdowns are implemented, they decide how stringent they'll be, and they'll decide when they're lifted. And this idea of skin in the game. So if you're a private business owner and you've lost all your income because of lockdown, you've got a lot of skin in the game because you're directly affected. If you're a public sector bureaucrat who's just enjoying working from home for a few months, you have no skin in the game. There's no incentive for you to ever lift the lockdown measures. And what we actually saw was many public sector workers received pay rises. So from the 1st of July 2020, it was only a few days before the Andrews government put Victorians into a second very devastating lockdown. The entire Andrews ministry took a 12% pay rise. So Dan Andrews himself took around a $46,000 pay rise, and his ministers, their pay rise was a little more modest at only $37,000. And then we've seen when the Victorian budget came out last week, Tim Pallas, the Victorian Treasurer, said some people have benefited greatly from the pandemic and it's time they pay their fair share. And he was talking about this in context of the $6 billion in new property and payroll taxes he was increasing. But he said nothing about his own 12% pay rise. Apparently he doesn't have to pay his fair share. He's exempt from all this. So that's really the divide we've seen between the public sector and the private sector. And we call it the K-shaped recovery. It's something that we've been teasing out for many months. And that's one of the real lessons from the past 12 months is the evidence is in now. We know who lockdowns affect. We know that they affect lower income people much more than they affect higher income people. We know that they affect small business owners much more than they affect big business owners. And we know that they affect private sector workers much more than public sector workers. So when you see governments implement lockdowns this year, they're knowingly impacting the poorest people in our society. They're knowingly impacting the private sector, and they're knowingly impacting small businesses. And that's been the real tragedy of the last year.
In the meantime, Cian Hussey, great piece in the print edition. Congratulations on your debut. I look forward to reading many, many more, and looking forward, as always, to getting you back on CounterCulture sometime soon.
Thanks, Gideon. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Now, if you're liking this show, you will love Morning Double Shot, a daily edition of Spectator Australia goodness brought to you by editor Terry Barnes. Terry is up bright and early each and every morning, scanning the news and offering you your first shot of comment for the day and helping you make sense of whatever madness the morning news brings. Plus, your daily highlights of what the Spectator Australia is saying about the issues that matter. And of course, as always, make sure you give this video a like and hit that subscribe button down below. New people are finding this channel on YouTube each and every day, and that's because of your help in beating that big tech algorithm and helping us get the message out. And now, as always, it's time to hear from Editor-in-Chief of the Spectator Australia, Rowan Dean. Rowan, how are you?
I'm great, Gideon, but you're heading off into lockdown. At least in New South Wales, we have some sanity at the upper levels of government. Long may it continue.
Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Gladys for Canberra. She's just about the best leader in the country right now. And the other observation I'll make is that we are now 62 weeks into 2 weeks to flatten the curve. So make of that what you will. But on another topic, you had a very, very strong editorial in this weekend's edition, and you make the observation that in a time of critical race theory, of anti-racism, of bending over backwards to acknowledge and to include every minority group under the sun, nobody seems to care about the Jews. So expand on that one for us.
Well, yes, Gideon. So the video footage that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, courtesy of people's iPhones, is truly, truly shocking. It's horrific. People being spat on, Jews being spat on in restaurants, just being beaten up in the street, kicked, punched, bloodshed, violence, truly horrific stuff all around the world, particularly in European capitals, New York, London, California, horrendous scenes on the Finchley Road, which of course runs up into North London, into quite a well-known Jewish area of London, with a bunch of Muslim thugs yelling out, we're going to rape daughters or something like rape Jews and rape their daughters or something. Horrific stuff. Now, let's not forget that we're 1 year from it's basically the first year anniversary of the death of George Floyd.
Yeah.
And if you think back to a year ago, Gideon, when the outrage to do with that few minutes of footage of, which was admittedly a horrific scene of Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck before he died. Horrific footage. But the whole world, you were tripping over politicians, business people, commentators, all desperate to get in front of a camera to say how important it was that Black Lives mattered to them. And they were speaking out. And I point out in my editorial, Gideon, that very few of them were brave enough to add on to that the corollary, which is Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. And that is why Black Lives Matter. For no other reason, they matter because all lives matter. Yet if you dared say that, you're accused of being racist. And somehow in the Orwellian world we live in, to say that all lives matter is a sign of racism, which I've never figured out. So here we have violence being filmed on a mass scale, every bit as horrific as the George Floyd one in terms of the potential outcome, death of individuals, potentially, certainly a lot of violence and injury. And yet, not a word. Where are the doctors' wives? Where are the, where are all those teachers with their little school kiddies who trot out at the drop of a hat into demonstrations? Where are the, where is the ABC? Where are the commentators? Where are the mainstream media? jumping up and down and saying, well, Jewish lives matter. Where are they? I haven't heard a single one. And in fact, the silence is deafening. Where are the silent vigils? Why don't we see a Je suis Cohen, a silent candlelit vigil?
Yeah.
Nothing. Absolute silence. And this is shameful. Our leadership has failed us yet again. Our leaders failed to call out Black Lives Matter for the racist movement it was, and now we're reaping the whirlwind, and particularly Jews are reaping the whirlwind.
Correct. Look, one observation I'll make is for all the shocking scenes we're seeing in London and Paris and New York and elsewhere, we haven't really seen it in any serious way in Australia, and thank God for that. Australia for now remains...
But let me just add to that, Gideon. Let me just add to that. We've had this week a member of Get Up, in fact, Get Up, running an ad in which a Palestinian activist deliberately and specifically links what she calls the colonial invasion of Palestine to the so-called colonial invasion of Australia, and deliberately incites Indigenous Australians to fight for the Palestinian cause, and makes the ludicrous claim that the indigenous that Palestinians are the indigenous peoples of what is now Israel and the West Bank, which is, of course, if you know your history, is a complete farce. But they are deliberately trying to link it to Australia to incite violence from those who support the indigenous cause to then become active, at least fighting is the word she uses, on behalf of Palestinians. So don't think that we are immune to this stuff.
No, we're not. But, in a way, that's just the ferals in the left. They turn each and every political conflict into a giant Rorschach test. I mean, the most ridiculous thing that they've done in the course of the Arab-Israeli conflict is say that there'll be no queer liberation without Palestinian liberation. As we've discussed time and time again, go to Ramallah or Gaza City and talk about queer liberation. Just don't go on any tall buildings and stay away from rooftops. Anyway, in better news, the great Neil Brown is back in this weekend's edition. So what does the great man have in store for us in the mag?
Well, Neil Brown is, of course, one of our finest writers. He's been with the Spectator Australia for many years. He was a cabinet minister back in the Billy McMahon era. He's not only a great, astute political mind with terrific political insights, but Neil is also, as Spectator readers know, one of the wittiest and best writers we're blessed with here in Australia. Neil's been very busy on some other things he's been doing, so for a few months he hasn't been able to write for The Spectator. He's back this week in spectacular fashion, where he takes a potshot at the budget in particular. And given that he knows all about Menzies and the Menzian governments, because he was around in those years, he is horrified at this suggestion that what the Liberal Party of Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg are putting up economically is in any way Menzian. He shoots that down, and he draws a rather sad conclusion that he feels that the Liberal Party has completely abandoned him, so he is abandoning the Liberal Party. He sees no connection between the Liberal Party he was a member of and a cabinet minister of and the Liberal Party of today.
Well, that's exactly right. And a lot of us are feeling that way. I joined the Liberal Party on my 16th birthday, and geez, it took a lot of mental energy and strength to renew my membership this year. But anyway, in the meantime, Rowan Dean, thank you to you. Great talking to you, and looking forward to reading more of that edition over the weekend. I'll have a lot of time on my hands.
Thanks, Gideon. You can read it 2 or 3 times over the next 7 days. Thanks, mate.
And remember, if you want to read more from our outstanding stable of talent at The Spectator Australia, just head right on over to spectator.com.au. And if you like what you see, and we know that you will, subscribe to The Spectator Australia today to get instant access to all of our outstanding content, including the weekly Spectator Australia magazine, all the articles in our online section, Flat White, and great international authors like Douglas Murray, Brendan O'Neill, James Dillingpole, Lionel Shriver, and many, many more. Just call 1-800-809-233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. Euthanasia. It's a controversial topic, but increasingly something that's being favoured by the political class, with proposals galore for what proponents euphemistically refer to as voluntary assisted dying. Now, as you all know, I am a libertarian, but I don't support euthanasia, at least not along the lines that are being proposed most commonly. I do accept that many people with a terminal illness do want to end their life, and in so doing end their suffering. And philosophically, in theory, I support their right to do so. I genuinely understand why people would want that option. Indeed, I would probably want it myself in that situation. But don't forget that in discussing euthanasia, we are talking about a mechanism by which the government, by which the state will deliberately kill people. And I don't trust government to get it right 100% of the time. It never gets anything right 100% of the time. And if a single person is killed under a government euthanasia scheme who shouldn't be, then that's already one person too many. We are talking about life and death here. Anyway, in this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia, psychiatrist Dr. Tanveer Ahmed writes that what is probably the best case against euthanasia you will read. He joins me now to talk about his piece. Tanveer Ahmed, how are you?
Great to be with you, Gideon. Thanks for having me.
Look, thank you for coming on. It's so good to get you on because I loved your piece in this weekend's edition of The Spectator. I think it's the best piece on the euthanasia debate I've read in a very, very long time. And what struck me was your claim in it that a lot of euthanasia patients are not necessarily suffering from physical pain, but actually existential pain, which is a very, very philosophical and very different take on euthanasia to any that I'd read. So talk us through that.
Yeah, I think we have this misconception that euthanasia is all about sort of intolerable physical pain that can't be remediated in any way. I think that's the impression we get. And there's a life-limiting illness of some kind. But when you actually see these patients, and particularly I quote a guy, Leroy Williams, who's the head of the palliative specialists in Australia, and the research actually shows the opposite. Most people who are considering euthanasia, when you interview them, they're talking about feeling abandoned, feeling like a burden, or just kind of more of these existential questions about going on, suffering. It's really about whether they can make sense of the suffering. And as you say, they're deeply sort of metaphysical, philosophical questions. And as a psychiatrist, I guess the key point I raise, well, hang on, this is actually exactly the same questions we deal with for many patients who we call as suffering mental illness and potentially suicidal. Yet on that side, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars. We frame it as pathological. We have huge resources trying to ameliorate that. But yet when suddenly it's in this different context, suddenly it's deemed perfectly rational. And not only perfectly rational, the states should intervene to try and expedite it and facilitate it.
We've all been through existential pain. Hell, I go through an existential crisis every, 3 or 4 years, and I don't mean to trivialise it, but, that's the human condition to me. And, again, you've elaborated on it and you've sort of attributed this euthanasia push in part to the existential question, which indicates to us that as a society, we've lost our ability to process and to digest and to rationalise suffering.
Exactly, Gideon. You're exactly right. And I say this in my work. I mean, one of the things I point to is the huge growth in diagnoses like post-traumatic stress disorder I refer to. That can also often be, it's this, the age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? I think that question increasingly, a lot of people, we can't entirely make sense of it, and then it often gets medicalised. Now, look, I should say, for those of us who, treat people when they're dying, and I mean, it's hugely affecting. And to be honest, the instinct is to, do whatever you can to relieve that without question. So for a lot of the people who, are supporting this, it clearly comes from a good place. I mean, the other point I raise, we're also a society that is completely averse to death. We have a total taboo against death. The coronavirus has completely shown that. When death's shadow shows up, we stick our heads in the sand. Like, we're not even interested in remotely thinking about risk and trying to balance the risk. We're not having a single case, and we'll do whatever it takes to do it. So really, underneath that is a real taboo around death. And it's shown up even more when you've got, all these bodies on corpses on pyres coming out from India. I mean, that contrast between how we, the culture of death here, where we're completely averse to it and avoid it at all costs, versus, other societies that have a kind of a more adjacent relationship with death. Now, I'm not saying we necessarily should have that, but I think part of the debate around euthanasia actually overlaps with our complete aversion to the notion of facing death. And a lot of the surveys, the surveys say 90% support for assisted dying and euthanasia. But my retort to that is 90% of us would not have a clue what we're going to think when we're faced with death, right? We would not have a clue. And the patients you see, most of them had never had to really think about it in any depth. Now, yes, we do think about it when relatives face it. So even a lot of the surveys that I think, to some extent the laws are based on, because the politicians think, there's widespread support for this. But I think it's under false pretenses because the people answering these surveys are just not at all informed. They're making these essentially thoughts, they're making these opinions, these assertions about what they might want to think in the face of death without really having a clue.
Look, it's a hard thing to confront your own mortality, and I think we've lost sight of that in the 21st century in particular. And, I watched my father die. He was in his 80s. It was completely natural causes. It was old age. But it's a very, very difficult thing to confront. And we've sort of inserted the state, I guess, as a quick fix and an in and out mechanism when dying is a more difficult thing to come to terms with. But look, I want to talk about something that you mentioned in the piece, which I found very alarming, which was that the draft Queensland bill on euthanasia had mental trauma as a reason to access, what they euphemistically call voluntary assisted dying. That can't be right, can it?
Isn't that amazing? I'd be very curious what that means, because that's not necessarily a psychiatric term, Gideon. And it brings up things internationally. Now there's cases in Europe where someone, aged in their 40s and 50s with autism, it wants to use the assisted dying laws, I think in the Netherlands or Belgium, and they're using the legal test of unbearable suffering or intolerable suffering. So you can see how the slippery slope, extends here. And one of the reasons often brought in the laws against you being able to access assisted dying laws is a psychiatric impairment, right? Even though you don't have to have mandatory psychiatric tests. But here we are bringing out a term of mental trauma. So almost any psychiatric condition you could suddenly conflate with mental trauma. So look, I'm sure there's a lot more to come about how they work these terminology into the Queensland laws. But already you can see so many contradictions and hypocrisies and so much room for alarm in this setting. And look, the doctors, I know we've spoken about this, Gideon. Doctors in most social issues, but much like professionals across the Western world, are veering heavily left and often align themselves up with social justice sort of trends. Yet on this issue, it's often them and religious groups who are holding the fort. I quote French author Michel Houellebecq, who says they're all upholding the honour of civilization. And to some extent, I agree with that. The other point I'd make here, look, there is a complexity to this because medical science now is so advanced. So the question is worthwhile, that what do we do in the face of death? Increasingly it is the long, slow goodbye, which is a term that used to be used for dementia. But I guess a lot of deaths now are something along those lines. It's the long, slow goodbye. So the broader question of what are the best ways to allow people die, to facilitate the least suffering is a reasonable one. But I think one of the things we don't discuss is how advanced palliative care is. And this is where my colleagues in that specialty often get very frustrated. They're like, you know what, we can actually deal with most of the physical suffering that comes now. We've actually got lots of different ways now. And of course, it's not perfect. Nobody wants to live with tubes or beeping machines. I take that. But we talk about science and applying the science, but this is an area where certainly a lot of my colleagues in palliative care kind of put their hands up in the air and go, well, hang on, you're not following the science here.
In the meantime, Tanveer Ahmed, thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad we finally got you on. It's an excellent piece in The Spectator Australia. I really do think it's one of the most important cases against so-called voluntary assisted dying or asking us to think again and rethink the issue of euthanasia that I've read in quite some time. So well done to you, and looking forward to talking to you again soon, I hope.
Pleasure, Gideon. Thank you.
And now let's hear what you had to say in the comment section of last week's video. Thomas writes, Gideon should debate friendly Geordies. Thomas, I would love to debate Friendly Geordies. And for those of you who don't know who he is, Friendly Geordies is a lefty YouTuber who released a lame video last year slagging me off, which I took as a compliment more than anything else. Now, I asked Mr. Geordies to come into the IPA studios and debate me like a man, but he demanded an appearance fee. Well, sorry, Friendly, you ain't going to get any money out of me or the Institute of Public Affairs. No siree. If you want to debate me, you're welcome anytime. And advancing Australia writes, I'm sick of Western conservatives grovelling for Israel. Israel is not our ally and has done nothing for us. Well, advancing Australia, I'm pretty sure Israel is an ally. But aside from that, as I explained last week, the reason most conservatives support Israel is because it is a free and democratic country living under the constant threat of radical Islamic terrorism. And I don't care if it's Israel, Italy, or Iceland, I'll always stand with any country that's standing up to terrorism. And now it's time to hear from our covers editor extraordinaire, Sarah Dudley. Sarah, how are you?
I'm great, Gideon, thank you. Great to see you.
Great to see you as always. Now, another UK edition front cover this weekend. What have we got?
Well, that's right. And it's written by fantastic journalist Matt Ridley, and he's putting China under the microscope to discover the origins of SARS-CoV-2, which is also been referred to as Wu flu, by those who are suspicious that the virus did not just inexplicably appear one day, one morning in a vat of bat soup in the Wuhan wet market, which is just a mere number of footsteps from the Institute of Virology, which by strange coincidence was researching coronaviruses that have been hacked up all over the world. They've been coughing up the viruses all over the world for the last 18 months, 3.5 million people dead, which brings me to the cover, Gideon, which is daubed in a large gout of blood in the shape of a map of China. And a magnifying glass has enlarged the stars of the Chinese flag, except they're not stars, they're viruses. And whodunit, the headline demands. And the article then delves into the murky depths of PCR obfuscation, large dollops of Trump derangement disorder, and legions of unscientific scientists dismissing possible lab leaks, and a Western media that are far more interested in calling out conspiracy theories rather than determining the origins of COVID-19.
Look, it's so interesting to see this debate play out in terms of the origins of the virus and the very likely chance now that it actually probably did come from the lab in Wuhan. But I remember a time when to suggest that you were written off as some sort of dangerous conspiracy theorist and a nut. But Spectator Australia authors have been on this from the very, very beginning. What have we had to say in the past?
Well, absolutely, Gideon. And I really would like to point out that Specky readers have been long aware of likely laboratory involvement in COVID-19 over the last 18 months because of the excellent work that our writers have done, especially Rebecca Weiser, Ramesh Thakur, and David Flint.
Correct, absolutely. Well, hashtag Spectator Australia was right. Let's get it trending, people, because we get it right many, many times, and this is no exception. But Sarah, in the meantime, thank you so much for this week's cover. Have a lovely weekend and think of us all under house arrest here in the People's Republic.
Yes, sorry to hear that, Gideon. Okay, see you soon.
Now let's see what else we have on offer for Spectator Australia subscribers this weekend. The great Mark Latham destroys Labor over its pathetic performance in last weekend's New South Wales by-election. The great James Allen gives us a very encouraging look at the resurgence of the American right. Very interesting perspective there. Over at Flat White, Morning Double Shot editor Terry Barnes reacts to Melbourne's record-breaking 4th lockdown. You don't want to miss that one. And in our world section, James Forsyth shares his analysis of former number 10 advisor Dominic Cummings' explosive evidence before a UK parliamentary committee. Links to all those stories and more will be in the show notes down below, or head straight on over to spectator.com.au. And remember, to stay up to date with all the information you need to make sense of this cuckoo clock of a world, sign up for Morning Double Shot, your free daily email of commentary and Spectator Australia highlights arriving in your inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. Just head on over to spectator.com.au. Well, a couple of weeks ago we chatted to Judith Sloan about her piece in the Spectator Australia querying whether childcare is the brilliant investment that it's cracked up to be. Childcare was, of course, a centrepiece of the big spending federal budget earlier this month and was widely praised for allowing new parents, mostly women, to work longer hours. But this week, Rachel Wong, who is the CEO of Women's Forum Australia, wrote a piece for Flat White asking the important question, do women actually want to work longer hours? It's a really, really interesting piece and a really, really interesting perspective, and we're delighted to be joined by her now. Rachel Wong, how are you?
I'm very, very well. Thank you, Gideon. Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
No, thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad we could get you on because I think you wrote a really, really important piece this week for Flat White about something that was sort of a headline in the budget, something we hear about a lot, which is childcare. But I personally have been, I guess, a little bit frustrated by the simplicity of this debate and the automatic assumption that, as with many other, if not most other political problems, the solution to it is more cash. So we've seen the government patting itself on the back about throwing $1.7 billion into childcare. What are your views on the nature of that debate? And is more cash in and of itself the solution here?
Look, I mean, I think more cash is helpful. I guess in relation to the piece that I wrote, I specifically was looking at the childcare subsidy in the new federal budget. And it was not so much that they were throwing cash, it was more what the cash was going to, I suppose, because, money helps families and particularly women who are looking after children to support them better. But what this particular policy was doing was saying that, we're going to give you more cash if you want to use childcare, basically. And the reality is that's not what every woman or parent or family wants. And look, don't get me wrong, I think that the initiative to provide more support for more childcare for families is a really good one. I think that it does help to give families more choice when it comes to maybe getting back into the workforce or progressing their careers, especially for women who are often the ones who do stay at home. But what it doesn't do is look at other kinds of family arrangements where actually maybe one of the parents wants to stay at home and maybe they would prefer money to subsidise doing that as opposed to, getting back into the workforce and spending their time there.
You wrote in the piece, and this is, I think, true, that I can speak from personal experience, but you wrote that a budget that presumes to know what women want is not actually pro-women. A budget that doesn't recognise the difference in family structures, the difference in parenting arrangements, actually doesn't do what it purports to do. So what are some of the other ways that we can support, not just, because it's not just a women's issue, it's a family issue, it's a societal issue. So what else can we do to, I guess, make it easier to balance a two-income family and the big responsibilities of raising children and running a home?
Yeah, so sort of as I was alluding to before, I think it's about the government supporting those different kinds of family structures. So whether it's providing support for more childcare, providing support so parents can stay at home if they want to, or maybe have an in-home nanny or something like that. I think those are all good things. I think another big thing, though, in terms of facilitating choice for women and for parents is actually changing cultural expectations and attitudes. So I think at the moment, look, I know I've got a lot of girlfriends who have had careers, who have started families, and being a mother and being a parent in general is a tough gig. And even more so when there are these sort of expectations about, how you should raise your child, when you should go back to work, that you should go back to work and all of that. And I think looking after children or staying in the home is something in our culture that is often looked down upon. And I think that in itself restricts women's choices and parents' choices because they sort of have this feeling that, if they're not looking after their family and also working and doing all these things, and they're not sort of making the mark. And so I think really trying to change cultural attitudes and expectations around how families are raising their children and working on all of that, I think that would be really helpful as well.
I think you raise a really, really good point because, look, I get it. And rightly so, we have done away with this idea of the stay-at-home mother, invariably barefoot and pregnant, all that stuff. That is a relic of the past and for good reason. We need to support both genders, in the workforce. We need to make the most of 100% of the population's talent, not 50%. Those are all wonderful things. The issue, I guess, that I have with this cradle to the grave system of, one size fits all state stewardship of young children is that I think we've overcorrected culturally. I think now we are moving towards a culture where the expectation is for a woman to go not only through 9 months of a pregnancy, not only through childbirth, not only through, the first, few weeks of a child's life, but then plop them off in a daycare, in a childcare centre and go back to the office when, in my experience, not all, but many women would actually prefer to spend months or even years with their children in that critical first stage of life, rather than, leave it in the care of some childcare centre. So what do you hear as CEO of Women's Forum Australia in terms of, the different kinds of, women in the workforce who are contemplating this, and what are your overall experiences with talking to your members and with Australian women?
I think the feedback that you've heard is pretty spot on. Obviously there are women who want to work more hours, who want to progress their careers, who want to get back into the workforce as soon as possible. And, they all have good reasons for that. But equally so, there are a lot of women out there who would just like to spend more time with their kids. My brother and sister-in-law had a baby recently in New Zealand. And I know for a fact that, she enjoys her job, but she would love to spend more time at home with her daughter. And my brother, in fact, would love to as well. So I think it's not just about, supporting women to be at home, but it's also about fathers to spend time with their children as well. We cannot underestimate the importance of, both parents being there in the early stages of their child's lives. There was actually this really interesting book that was released a few years ago. I think the author's name was Erica Commissar. She was a psychoanalyst in New York, and she wrote this book about the science of early childhood development, the importance particularly of mothers being there in the first few years of their child's life. And it was just fascinating. It stirred up a lot of controversy. She'd consider herself sort of quite left-wing or, liberal thinking and so on. But the Conservatives sort of loved her book, and, those on the left really didn't like it. So the Conservatives were sort of like, this is what we've been saying for years, and it's, it's so important. And then I guess those on the other side were saying, you're going to set women back by these kinds of thoughts. But she was really just looking at the science and looking at how important it is to have parents, particularly mothers, there in the first few stages of life. And, that's not to say that that's going to work for every family. Obviously it depends what the careers are, how many children they have and all of that. But it's just interesting to kind of look a little bit outside what the current expectations and approaches are.
You're right, and I think part of the problem is we aren't valuing parenting like we did. I think there is a undercurrent of a certain segment of society that looks down on stay-at-home parents of either gender. And I think part of the problem also is that it's basically impossible these days to get by on a single income for a family. That's, I think, the missing piece of all this. And, the cost of living, the cost of that mortgage, the cost of school fees, the cost of running a home, it's just going up and up and up. But look, in the meantime, Rachel Wong, thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you for writing for The Spectator Australia. It's been great to have your voice and your perspective within the broad church. There's The Spectator Australia and our ideas. And I really do look forward to catching up with you again soon as this debate develops.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Gideon. Have a great day.
Well, this program is a co-production of the Institute of Public Affairs. For 78 years and counting, the IPA has been Australia's voice for freedom, democracy and the Australian way of life. We fight for freedom of speech, the power of the free market, an honest debate on climate change and the timeless value of Western civilization. We don't receive a cent of funding from government and are not beholden to nervous advertisers. We speak out only because of the support of the thousands of proud, paid-up, patriotic Australians who are IPA members. So sign up now to the Institute of Public Affairs and support our research, as well as exclusive benefits like priority access and discounts to IPA events, our quarterly magazine, the IPA Review, our weekly email roundup for freedom enthusiasts called Hey, What Did I Miss? Regular updates from Executive Director John Roscombe offering his take on the tough issues of the week, policy updates from our gun research team giving you all the ammunition you need to own that lefty mate at your next insufferable dinner party, and some merch as well. And of course, on top of all that, you'll be supporting the IPA's research into freedom, democracy and the Australian way of life. Just head on over to ipa.org.au/join, sign up today and join Australia's voice for freedom. Well, that's it for this edition of CounterCulture right here on Spectator Australia TV. Now, this will be the last weekly episode of CounterCulture for a while. We'll be going on a bit of a hiatus, but in the immortal words of Donald J. Trump, we will be back in some form. In the meantime, all Spectator Australia content and IPA research featured today is available in the show notes down below. Remember to sign up for regular updates with Morning Double Shot over at spectator.com.au. And remember, to access all our content from the Spectator Australia, just call 1-800-809-233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. Until next time, friends.